Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I will begin with a cliche, and I promise you that it'll be the last one you'll hear this evening. We live in a world that is saturated with images. You know this. Most of them are trying to sell things to us. The rest of them are trying to keep us watching until the advertising arrives. And yet there's never been a more important time to be seeing clearly and to be seeing through those images. So it really is a special opportunity, and I'm very, very excited to be here with two people who I consider to be the most, certainly among the most essential artists working today. People who imbue images with hard truths, with history, with guts and sex appeal, and humor, and underlying all of that, a form of solidarity, which is the natural kind of corollary of good journalism. So they're both artists. They've come at it from different directions, from opposite directions, but they're both artists, they're both journalists. They're both here today, thanks to the Indian Summer Festival. Molly Crabapple and Joe Sacco. So, it's great to have you guys here. Molly, when I think of Molly's art, I wouldn't attempt to summarize it, but when I think of Molly's art, I think of her genius for casting light on bodies, on human bodies that have been marked or targeted or hidden in some sense by the state. Now, whether those are burlesque dancers in the underground of the New York burlesque scene, or whether they're prisoners in supermax prisons or in Guantanamo, Molly finds them and she illuminates them. She makes those bodies beautiful and those stories gripping and impossible to look away from. She works sometimes with collaborators. They include the rapper Jay-Z, in case you've heard of him. They also include Marwan Hisham, a journalist formerly based in Raqqa. He was there during the fighting that surrounded Raqqa in Syria during the civil war. And they are co-writers of Molly's upcoming book. The book that Molly published a year ago is Drawing Blood. It is a part memoir, part coming-of-age story of an artist in New York, and it's part an artistic manifesto that is so inspiring and so inclusive that I really think that every young woman, every young artist, and all the rest of us as well should read it. It's a beautiful book, and I assume it's available later this evening. Hi, Molly. Joe, now you guys, everyone knows who Joe Sacco is. I knew who Joe Sacco was when I was, when I was in college in India, but here he is now. Joe helped to create the genre that, and I'm not really sure what it is called, but I would call comic book journalism or journalistic comic art. Very early on, or relatively early on, Joe made a visit to Palestine, and one of his books, which is among the contemporary classics that he's created, is his book on Palestine, about which no one less than Edward Said said, with the exception of one or two novelists and poets, no one has ever rendered this terrible state of affairs better than Joe Sacco. So that's praise that's higher than anything I can lay on him right now, but we'll be seeing a lot more of them because both of them are going to begin, of their art, because both of them are going to begin the evening by showing us some slides before we get into the conversation. To me, Joe's work, nearly every page that he creates is like a tapestry that reveals the ways in which fact is stranger than fiction. So let me hand it straight over to you. Let's see some of that work, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to try to figure this thing out. What I'm going to do is just run through a few slides that are representative of my work. This one is from the book that Raghu mentioned, Palestine. It's the first book of journalism I did. This particular image is from a clash in Ramallah. I was living in Berlin and I wanted to see what was going on in the occupied territories, so I traveled there and spent a few months in the 1991-1992. and I did 9 comics. They were floppy book comics that were later collected into a book, and each comic sold progressively less than the next. It just sold less and less and less, and the publisher should have really canceled it, but they stuck with it. That was my first experience. I guess I have to turn this on. I'm not sure what I have to point this at. Here? Just a minute. Maybe I got it now.
He's
All
not
right.
a technician.
Okay. This is from a book I did about the Bosnian War. I went to Bosnia in September 1995. I spent 4 months. Originally, I went to see Sarajevo because that's what I was hearing about, the multicultural place in former Yugoslavia that was under siege. But I gravitated to the safe area Gorazda, which was in eastern Bosnia, when I realized that no one had really told this story. When I got there was when it really opened up, and as a journalist you could go there, and everyone was just glad to see any foreign face that wasn't a peacekeeper, that they were, I was being invited into people's homes, and they were making cakes with the sugar they were finally getting after 3.5 years of a siege. And that book took me a few years to do, and I did another book about a guy in Sarajevo named Nevin, who was a fixer, and I could never really afford his services. A fixer is someone who takes a journalist around. He or she is a guide and a translator. And Nevin was a very problematic sort of person, and I wanted to tell this story because it was a way of talking about the seams in journalism, because a fixer can be very good, or it can be someone who will manipulate the story, will tell you things that haven't been said by someone you're talking to, will steer people that you're interviewing away from certain things. And that was the next book I did. Okay, this is a book, this is a short story I did about some time I spent with American Marines in Iraq. It was for The Guardian. They were a reserve unit at Haditha, which was a dam. And I was embedded. I know that gets has a bad connotation, but as far as I'm concerned, it was interesting to listen to American soldiers, what they had to say. I mean, I feel I've been embedded with the Palestinians, so the word itself doesn't trouble me. I did a story from southern Russia, a province down in the Caucasus called Ingushetia, where a lot of Chechen refugees were. This is toward the end of the Chechen War, but the war was still raging. And mostly it was about women and children. A lot of the women were widows, and a lot of the women were the ones supporting families if there were families. So it was really concentrated on them. And this was about the time that Putin was trying to convince the world that the war in Chechnya was completely over, and was trying to push these displaced persons back into Chechnya, and a lot of them refused to go. This woman, she saw me coming, and there you have to have bodyguards to travel. So she saw me coming with these bodyguards who were in military police uniform and carrying AK-47s, and she thought I was there to take her back to Chechnya. So this was her reaction, you know. I did a story from the country I was born in, Malta, about African migrants trying to reach Europe, and they get in the boats, and they're usually trying to get to Italy from Libya at this stage. This was relatively early on in the migrant situation. A lot of them end up in Malta because it's the first land they see after a long period at sea. So this is showing this particular image is from a story told to me by an Eritrean man who was escaping a brutal regime there. And what he described to me is basically a story of a lot of people there. At that time, a lot of the people getting to Europe were people who had money, because to get to Europe, you have to pay smugglers all the way up. So usually it was a representative of a family that was going to go and figure things out in Europe, perhaps send back money. I spent time, I guess this ties in with the festival, I spent time in the UP, Uttar Pradesh, and this is a story I did called Kushinagar, which was about rural poverty in India. And it's about Dalits, perhaps one of within the Dalit system, these people are considered rather low. They were Musahars, I think they called them. And it was about them, it was about the government schemes that are there to alleviate their poverty. And the way those schemes are used, a lot of money is skimmed off the top, and they're used to enrich people on the village level. Thanks for doing this, by the way. This is from a story I did that is included in a book by Am Joel, who's here tonight, and a guy named Matt Hearn. It's called The Sweetness of Life. It's about Alberta, and it's about Fort McMurray in particular, and its relationship to climate change. I did just a 10-page piece within their book, but I thought I'd include it because it has a Canadian motif. This is the book I'm working on now, also a Canadian motif. It's about the Northwest Territories, and it's about the Dene people and their relationship to resource extraction. Anyway, that's what I thought it was about, but then obviously it turns into something else, and it turns into really a story about colonialism and the effects of colonialism, particularly through the residential schools, which I'd heard of, but I didn't understand the full gravity of that situation until I was there. So I made 2 trips up there, and it was actually, it was a difficult story to do. I wasn't sure how to approach it exactly, and it took a second trip to really get it right. And then this last slide is from a book that I will do after the book about the Northwest Territories. This is about a riot in in Muzaffarnagar that took place in 2013. And I'm basically interested in how the riot was used, how it's what people tell themselves about the riot about a year later, Hindus and Muslims. The riot was between the 2 groups. And that is an upcoming book, and it's called The Once and Future Riot. And that's it.
Can I assume that we're among the first people to see that final page, Joe? Are we among the first people to see that final page?
In fact, you are. I wasn't sure if I should show it. And you know, the truth is I won't be able to get to that book for another year and a half. So I've done the research. I was there and I did the research. It's just stored up.
Thanks for sharing. I get to more bragging rights. Molly, over to you.
Hey, that was hard to follow. So my name is Molly Crabapple, and I'm an artist and a journalist. And I suppose what I started doing really began with my sketchbook. I was someone who was a very awkward, weird child, like so many artists, and I had no way to interface with the world and no way to talk to people except to draw them. And everything I've done has come out of that. For years, I drew the sort of people who fascinated and enticed me. I drew burlesque dancers, I drew models, I drew fire eaters, acrobats, trapeze artists, all of those glittering girls and boys of the underground. But in 2011, my work took a radical turn. This thing called Occupy Wall Street happened across the street from where I live, which was an occupation of a city square in New York against financial injustice, which was so paradoxical because I had thought Americans were so passive that every single time I would hear screams outside my window, and it would just be for the football game and not for the pitchfork-wielding mob that I thought should be there. But Occupy was Americans saying, no, this system is rotten to the core, and I think we're still living in the ripples of that. This was a poster that I did that was for the general strike about 6 months afterwards, and it was on walls all around the country, which is much more beautiful than any gallery. After Occupy, I found myself chasing what it felt like in those squares, what that love felt like, what that love and rage and rebellion felt like. And so I started traveling, in this case with a journalist friend, to other places that had occupations like this. In 2012, we went to Greece, where there had been mass anti-austerity protests. And me and a journalist friend named Laurie Penny did a book called Discordia about the life under austerity for young people in Athens, and also about the fight back against it. This was a young boy who was walking home after neo-Nazis had clashed with Pakistani residents of a local neighborhood. The neo-Nazis had threatened to burn down the shops of Pakistani storekeepers, and the Pakistani residents held a demonstration that said, no, you can't burn down our shops, and we're not going to leave. And the neo-Nazis beat up a bunch of people, and this was people walking home afterwards.
It looks like you're riffing on the famous image
Ruby Bridges, I am indeed. After that, I started to make a name for myself, doing something which Joe pioneered, but which not a lot of other artists have done, which is going to places where things were going down and drawing them. And in 2013, I went to one of the most censored places on earth, and a place that simultaneously where the worst things are going down, but where things also seem frozen in amber, and that is Guantanamo Bay. I made several trips to Guantanamo Bay, and I drew the hearings of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and had my work approved by government censors. But I also drew things like the force-feeding chair, where men protesting indefinite detention were tied down and had cans of Ensure pumped into their stomach. The smiley face is because I was not allowed to draw guards' faces. I think that you should, if you're being censored, draw the censorship. After Guantanamo, I got a gig at Vice magazine that sent me kind of ricocheting around the world, drawing things like sectarian snipers in Lebanon, or South Asian construction workers in Abu Dhabi who were constructing the great museums of the future for about $200 a month. Or the occupied territories. Here, this is in Hebron, one of the most contentious areas of the West Bank, where these incredibly aggressive settlers, many of them from America, not only steal land, but actually steal people's apartments in the city. And here you can see these settlers, this guy had just thrown a rock, being guarded by the Israeli army as they take their Friday trip through central Hebron to go to the synagogue there. This is a street divided between the Israeli half and the Arab half, and those two gentlemen there had just taken my friend's ID booklet. I also was able to go to Gaza, which is this place that is so claustrophobically small. You can't understand how small it is until you stand on top of the highest point there and you realize you can kind of see everything, right? And when you're there, the smallness is only exacerbated because you can hear the drones buzzing above, and at night when Israel feels like it, you can see the lights of the gunships on the ocean. I was there covering Shujaiya, which was a neighborhood that had been destroyed in the 2014 invasion, and actually had the chance to sit on the balcony while shells were falling. These are from Iraqi Kurdistan, where I embedded with Doctors Without Borders, and I sat with families that were about to make the trip to Europe, and I just sort of spoke with them and heard what they said. I kind of wrapped up these parts of my life in my book, Drawing Blood. But the thing is, I said that 2011 was a bit of a breaking point, right? And I feel that we have, in America, have another rupture, which is the election of the orange man. And I had a bit of a front row seat to this. I got to crash one of his press conferences in Dubai in 2014 and ask him why he paid his workers so little to construct buildings he said were so luxurious. But I also chronicled the RNC, the Republican National Convention, the most incredibly militarized horror show filled with people with guns strapped to their thighs, lots of denunciations of the media, Alex Jones, and a man crowning himself king. I'll wrap up by speaking about my current project, the project that has sort of taken over my life for the last year and a half. Back in 2014, I started working with one of the most incredible people I've ever been lucky enough to meet, who's a journalist living in, well, he was living in Raqqa at the time. And Raqqa was, of course, occupied by ISIS. And so this young Syrian guy named Marwan Hisham was risking his neck every day to tweet about the situation in the city. And we became friends on Twitter, and then he started sending me surreptitious photos for me to draw from. And we ended up doing a series of collaborations, not just about Raqqa, but about Mosul and Aleppo, where he would write and I would draw, and I would get to see things that it was something, you know, when you're seeing something that you're not supposed to see, right? When you're getting photos that are done in defiance of not just, you know, the religious fundamentalist terror group that had occupied his city, but also in defiance of a world that puts up borders that makes it so hard for people like him to leave, and yet you're seeing that anyway through each other's eyes. To me, that shows that art can indeed subvert borders. It can indeed go beyond walls and laws. This was in Raqqa when ISIS had censored the billboards and painted their logo on the famous clock tower. And this, which no one has ever seen before, you guys, is from our book. We're working on a book together now, drawing Brothers of the Gun, it's called. It's his memoir of the Syrian Revolution, the Syrian Civil War, and ISIS, and about the choices that young working class men make in war. And this picture is from video that Marwan shot. It's a portrait of a man named Ismail, who was the first civilian victim of an American airstrike in Syria, being pulled out of the rubble of a factory where he was working as a security guard. And I think a lot about what art can do and what art can't do, and I think a lot about how the Syrian war is the most chronicled war in terms of videos and in terms of photos. Every single aspect, every single side has been chronicled. And yet it's something that so many people don't want to look at, and something where there's so much confusion and misinformation and even cruelty, even by people who are in no way involved, just a cruelty of perception. And I knew that no Americans are going to look at a blurry video captioned in Arabic on YouTube, and yet I wanted them to see the first person killed in Syria by American bombs. So I drew that. And to me, the purpose of art, and I don't want to be so vain as to talk about the purpose of all art, but the purpose of my art is to make bits of the world more complex, more tragic, more beautiful, more entertaining, more everything than people ever possibly imagined, to show all of that complexity and all of that humanity in the face of the forces of idiocy that reign today. And I think that galleries are cool, but that the best art is sometimes in the streets. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing those, Molly, and also especially for showing us that image from your book that isn't out yet. I'm going to lead off from that but I'm going to be deliberately dense and get very basic and ask you both, why draw? I mean, where, like I said at the beginning, everyone can take photographs now, and photographs can be shared enormously easily. But as we can all tell, drawing has a potential in revealing things that photography and video might not have. So I'm very curious to know what it is to you that drawing enables and shares that's possibly outside of the realm of photography and video.
Oh God, well, 1,000 things, right? I mean, the first thing that drawing does is drawing lets you get beyond censorship. Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. You know, there are so many places in this world that power doesn't want you to see, right? Power doesn't want you to see inside prisons. It doesn't want you to see what customs checkpoints look like. It doesn't want you to see inside detention centers. It doesn't want you to see borders. All of these things, right? And you can't take photos there. I mean, a lot of times they search you and make sure that you don't have any photo-taking devices. But you can draw. You can draw because drawing is something that is concealable. It's subtle. It could be taken from your memory. I remember one time I was in Rikers visiting someone, and they take everything off you. They search you. They make you shake out your bra before you go in, and they search under your tongue with a flashlight to make sure you don't have anything with you. But afterwards, I drew with my nail on a little stub of paper they give you to redeem your possessions. Because they cannot stop people from drawing, right? It's something that completely defeats censorship. I mean, look at all of the drawings that have come out of prisons, out of concentration camps, out of gulags. Drawing also saves things from the memory hole. One of the things I always cite in Joe's work, and Joe has been such an influence on me, and I'm so humbled to be here, is his drawings of the memories of people who had been in Israeli prisons. I mean, these were things where there's no camera, right? They're supposed to be forgotten, they're hidden from view, and yet Joe with his pen is able to seize them back, and he's able to make things explicit that were supposed to go hidden. And the third thing drawing is for me is drawing is a demonstration of care. Like, I'm a really bad photographer. I get my thumb in the photos half the time. But even I can go. So, even I can take like a bajillion, like click, 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 and then put a filter on it, right? And there's like so many photos, and like a lot of times no effort goes into it. It's just like click, click. Whereas drawing makes effort apparent. Drawing shows, I looked at this, and it went into my eye and through my hands. Now you should look at it too. So that's why I draw. Also, you get to make friends when you're awkward.
This works. I think that what Molly said is, I don't really have to reiterate any of that. One thing we were talking about, we met for dinner just before this, and one thing I would add to that is that I think drawing allows you to look at things that would be very difficult to look at if you were seeing a photograph or if you saw a film. And the example I mentioned was those absolutely awful video images of people being necklaced in South Africa. I remember seeing some of that stuff on the news and just having to look away. And the truth be told, photography is really good at capturing such vivid awfulness that I have to often just look away. I mean, I'm glad someone has documented those sorts of things. What I think drawing does is add a filter. It sort of allows someone to look. It allows a person to look at something that otherwise would be really difficult to see through those media that are considered absolutely literal.
And yet it's a somewhat radical and an unusual decision to bring drawing to the service of journalism, and there are only very few artists who do that. I'd love to hear more about what each of your experiences was. Achieving not just the renown that you both have, but also the credibility as people using an unusual format, an unusual form to report such hardcore topics. So, for instance, Molly. So, I think that I could say that Joe was a journalist before he was a comic journalist. Molly was an artist before she was a political artist. Is this accurate? Joe, I think you were looking for regular journalism jobs, right?
I had lousy journalism jobs. I mean, they were things that really were dispiriting, So I don't really count that as
them.
Yeah, that's most of them. So yeah, I wouldn't say I was a journalist at that point. I was making a living doing rock posters and album covers and things like that.
Of course. So did you face any barriers in bringing in getting published, or in finding editors who believed that this was the right way to present really serious stories?
I mean, the first barrier was myself, because I wasn't sure what I was doing, and though I had started trying to make a career in comics, to go to some place like the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and to think I'm going to come out of this with a comic book seemed sort of strange, even to me. And when people would ask, what am I doing, not knowing exactly what I was doing, I would say I'm working on a journalistic project. I wasn't sure how to really tell people. With time, that sort of changed. I learned that it could work to my advantage. When I forgot to mention, I had done a book about Gaza, Footnotes in Gaza, which is probably my longest book. I forgot to put a slide up there. But when I went to the West Bank, when I went back to Gaza for the second time, some years later, I had the first book, Palestine, to show people. And rather than put people off, like, what's this cartoonist doing here? This isn't serious sort of work. Drawing it's a very universal sort of thing. I mean, you were talking about making friends that way, and I'm sure you attract this attention, and people are curious. They understand what you're doing. If I said, well, I've written a book about your situation, it was published some years ago, and here it is, and it was gray text, that would have meant nothing to someone who doesn't speak the language of the book, English. But here were these old people, because I was generally interviewing older people, who could open up my first book, Palestine, open it up, and that's a refugee camp. That was their lives, being shown. And it was clear, right away to them what I was doing, and suddenly they perked up. They got it right away.
And it's a form of accountability for you as well.
Yeah, because they know. I mean, people know visually what they've experienced. And it's actually almost a higher form of truth, because to get someone's visual experience right is difficult.
I think the other thing that's sometimes helpful when you're an artist who's working as a journalist is that photography is actually kind of intrusive and suspicious if you think about it. Like, if you have people who are living in the worst moment of their life, their house has been bombed, and they're living in a tent next to their house, and then you come and you stick a camera in their face and you're videotaping something perhaps that they find very, very humiliating, or photographing it, and very often you're doing it without consent. I mean, that can feel incredibly intrusive and degrading to people, and it can really, really put people off, or at least make them suspicious at first, even if you're producing the most beautiful pictures with it. Whereas when you draw, it's transparent. You take photos, you put them into a machine, but you make drawings. You're just sitting there with your sketchbook, and they can look right over at you and say, like, oh, that's what you're doing. Doesn't look like my son. They can see what you're doing in real time. I've always had really good luck with people. My last story that I did, I went into this refugee camp in Greece. They weren't giving media permission, so I found where the camp was on GPS, hiked into the mountains, and found a lady from Aleppo, and I explained to her what I was doing. She took me through a hole in the fence, and I ended up hanging out there. And people there were like really fed up with the media, because there had been so much coverage of the refugee crisis, and people hadn't seen anything from it, right? They were still living in these miserable tents, and winter was coming, and they were still eating MREs with maggots in them. But art had a different place. Art was something that they felt was different than people with cameras or with video cameras, and so I got perhaps a lot more access than I would have otherwise.
No offense to the guy in the front row with the camera, because
Yeah, sorry.
you're going to get a lot of unflattering photographs out of this. No, but you and I have also talked about how not being taken seriously, being dismissed both because you are an artist with a sketchbook and because you're a younger woman, can be played to your advantage.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, think about it. Very often what you're doing as a journalist is you're covering things people don't want you to see. I mean, people don't particularly want ferocious investigative journalists in Guantanamo Bay for obvious reasons, right? Very often I've been able to get the documentation that I needed because people who were in charge of giving that documentation didn't think I was a threat. They're like, oh, it's just some chick with a sketchbook. What's that gonna do? And then, of course, they learned. But the point of being a journalist isn't so that you can, really impress, like the military guy who's issuing you your credentials with what a badass you are. I mean, the point is to get a story, right? To tell a truth. And very often, being underestimated is extremely useful for getting that.
Fantastic. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one thing that you both have a very wide and intrepid geographical range. Some of Joe's most classic work is from Bosnia and from former Yugoslavia. You've also we've seen a sampling of it, but even that's a very basic sampling. You've also got work coming out from Canada and from India, and Molly's got a similar range throughout, especially the Middle East. But it's obvious that Palestine is a central focus for both of you, and both of you have done work that's incredibly powerful out of the occupied territories. So I'm curious about how it was that you were drawn there in two different periods of the occupation of those territories.
I mentioned some of this yesterday at the panel, but I studied journalism, and I was taught the American style of objective journalism, and I feel around the time of the Sabra Shatila massacre in Lebanon, when Palestinians were killed in refugee camps in Beirut by Christian allies of Israel, I began to see that something else was going on than Palestinians were terrorists. Actually, what it ended up being for me was a critique of journalism, a critique of what I had studied and what I was told, that objective style journalism was the be-all and end-all. And what objective style journalism had shown me or taught me or pushed into my head was that Palestinians were terrorists. And I realized what had happened is that facts were reported. Yes, there was a hijacking. Yes, a bus was attacked. There were all these incidents that were reported, but I began to understand there were many other things that were not reported, and context was never provided. And if the only time you heard the word Palestinian was with hijacking, bus bombing, commando raid, then yes, you think Palestinians are terrorists. So I actually had to get that out of my mind and learn something else. And I was actually angry at how American journalism, which I had studied, had pulled the wool over my eyes. It was one of the reasons I went. The other is I live in the United States, and we are helping to fund that and enable it to this very day. And so there's an additional layer of responsibility. So there I was, drawing rock posters in Berlin, thinking, I'm actually relatively close to Jerusalem, maybe I should try to get there. And once I thought that in my head, I had to do it.
So that was your first sort of excursion into political journalism in the comic form?
Yes.
I actually was I was in Palestine for a literary festival. It was amazing, a festival called PalFest, touring. Really a great thing. I found some of my favorite writers there. But one of the things I was struck with there, and it's something that Joe touches upon, is that the bias of journalism is towards the single and spectacular incident, right? Like the the plane hijacking, for instance. Simple, boom, boom. What journalism does a bad job talking about is it does a bad job talking about the grind and texture of daily life, because that's not as exciting a story with as good as a narrative arc. But the grind and texture of daily life is what makes everything happen, including the plane being hijacked. And the grind and texture of daily life in the occupied territories is one of just constant, just sort of humiliation, I would say. I mean, like you don't write a newspaper story on the fact that if you were going from Ramallah to Jerusalem, which is basically like almost the same city, parted by a wall, you have to go through this checkpoint. And the checkpoint is called Kalandia. And it's minded by these teenage army conscripts, mostly girls. And there are these turnstiles, and the turnstiles, are you basically push a button and the turnstile works, right? And these army conscripts are so busy checking Facebook that the turnstile every 3 or 4 people just sort of like freezes and traps you in the middle of it, or else like whacks you. And multiply this with you're not allowed to take your stuff, and it's like so hot, and it's surrounded by barbed wire, and you're in a cage, and this lasts like 2 hours every day as you go to work, if you're so lucky as to have a work permit. And you think about that, and you apply that not just to this one checkpoint that you go through every day, but to everything. That level of low-level cruelty and discomfort and indifference, and it all being because of your race. And then you mix that with the actual sort of spectacular violence of what the occupation does. And then, yes, that does lead to, that may lead to a plane hijacking. That may lead to other forms of violence. But if you don't have an understanding of what the actual life and the actual humiliation and daily violence feels like, you can't understand any of that as opposed to, you can't understand any of that as it truly is. So I decided to spend more time in Palestine, and I was able to get a pass to go into Gaza especially, which was a little bit hard. I had to get permission both from the Israelis and from Hamas to go in. And I think the thing that compelled me to it was, in America, we get this very, very ridiculous idea of Israel, and especially because I'm Jewish myself, I had a particularly distorted idea of it. And it's like only democracy in the Middle East, and they're so rational, and like everyone speaks English there, like really, really well, and they seem like us. And America turns its lens to the Palestinians, and it portrays them in this really stereotypical way. And what I found when I was in Palestine and when I was in Israel was so very, 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 very different than that. And I suppose that was what compelled me to do work on it.
So I want to draw you out on some other sorts of art that you guys make. Of course, we've been talking about reportage so far. But some of the work you've done that I love the most, and this applies to both of you, is telling historical stories. You've both also worked with fiction. In Notes from a Defeatist, I don't know if there's other work you've done in fiction, Joe, but you have these kind of maybe crumb-like vignettes from the life of despicable Americans, I suppose. And Molly has actually been learning Arabic most admirably, and just had published her first translation of a short story from Arabic, which was on BuzzFeed about a week ago. So obviously the imagination has to work on material slightly differently in order to create art about what isn't contemporary and what isn't available to see. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Say about historical subjects or about, well, Joe, in your case, I'm more curious about the historical topics. And your second to last book was a perfect example. It was an enormous fold out, a single panel image of the First World War.
Right. I guess I neglected to put a slide of that up there too. It was called The Great War, and it was a fold-out book about the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And the reason I did that book is because an old friend who was an editor at Norton called up and said, wouldn't it be great if you drew an image of the Western Front that folded out? But that didn't sound interesting to me, though I sort of grew up absolutely fascinated with the First World War. I grew up in Australia, and in Australia, the First World War is what they consider to be the place where they developed real nationhood, the Anzacs at Gallipoli. That's where they spilled blood, and they were ready to sort of detach themselves from the empire, more or less, you know, after that. So I grew up with all these stories about the First World War, and so the subject interested me, but a static image of the Western Front seemed really boring. But then I thought it would be interesting to see if you could tell a narrative in a single image, because we read long images, I think, left to right, if we're from this culture. So starting at one side of the drawing all the way to the other, basically showing the general planning, or the general in charge, General Haig. You show soldiers going up to the front, all the logistics involved, provisions being provided, soldiers going into the trenches. Again, you're moving from left to right, then going over the top, being wiped out in no man's land, returning to the trenches, the wounded walking back to the casualty clearing stations. That seemed interesting to me. That involved a lot of research. Some of it was already on my bookshelves, but I had to go to the Imperial War Museum to look into the photo archives to look at all those details that most books don't show. I mean, most books aren't going to show images of how mules were harnessed to carry grenades to the front line. Whereas at the Imperial War Museum, there's a whole binder full of photos about mules, one after another.
They're more important than you'd think.
They are in those days, they were more important than you think. So that was interesting to me. It also gave me a chance to do something different from what I've done, because most of the journalistic work, I try to really feature individuals and their stories, which is very important. But as time has gone by, and as more cynicism has sort of creeped into me, I've begun to think of the human species. A lot of my work now, actually, even the journalism work, is looking at bigger, broader issues in a certain sense. But this was a way of thinking about how people act in groups. And you can say one thing about the First World War, but it was a group effort. And the first day of the Battle of the Somme involved a lot of men working toward a common aim, but of course, for the purposes of having themselves slaughtered. So it helped me think about other things. So when I was drawing soldiers going to the front, there's a famous film about the first day of the Battle of the Somme, waving their helmets in the air to a camera, because they thought they were going to just walk into the German trenches that were blown to smithereens after 7 days of a barrage. That sort of enthusiasm interested me. And it helped me reflect as I was drawing. I mean, the good thing about drawing is you get into something, and in some ways I probably get more out of my art, I think, than any reader could, because I'm really thinking about those sorts of things. It gives me a time to reflect.
Go ahead. I'll hold that question for both of you.
Well, I've done a few pieces of, I suppose, historical research, but never anything as deep as Joe's, so I'll speak about fiction. Recently, I was honored to get to translate work by Zakaria Tamar, who is a Syrian short story writer who writes with incredible sort of darkness and scathing perceptivity. I mean, and who wrote all of that under the confines of an incredibly brutal dictatorship. He's 86 years old now, and he only just really went into exile in England. I translated a story of his about Omar Khayyam, the famous Persian poet, being dug up from the ground and hauled before military court to answer for why he was encouraging the consumption of wine, which was a foreign good, and the state had banned the consumption of foreign goods. And it's this amazing short story, right? Because it's all about the glorious the glorious past and how it's portrayed by the shabby authoritarian regimes of the present. And, sometimes I think what is so lovely about doing work with fiction writers and illustrating something like Zakaria Tamar's story is that you're not responsible to anyone except yourself and your own conscience. You're not doing anything about anyone's real life. You're not thinking, oh, if I write this, someone might go to prison, or it has none of those confines of journalism. It has none of that weight. You're free. It has miraculous irresponsibility. And I think that is what I most love about it.
So, Joe, this makes me think of a panel of an image that you showed us, a page in which there were, I think, from the new work about the Northwestern Territories, there were what were obviously portraits of some of your interviewees, and they shared the same page with an image of, a historical image of maybe of two pioneers dragging a canoe up a riverbank. Now, one of those was clearly drawn very closely from life, and the other one, not at all. It makes me wonder, in drawing of this sort, and this goes for both of you, is drawing somewhat agnostic to the distinction between fiction and nonfiction?
I'm afraid I don't know what you mean.
So you didn't see those pioneers dragging that canoe up the bank. Mm-hmm. We can infer that happened very often in the Northwestern Territories, but it would probably class as fiction if you had to pin a label on it, because it's an image from your imagination.
Yes, I mean, you have to give yourself permission. I've long come to terms with the tension that's sort of inherent in this sort of work, which is you're writing things, quotes, let's say that from a journalistic perspective, you say that's an accurate quote. Then you're drawing something that is very subjective. I'm not afraid of that subjectivity. In fact, what I like about drawing is that it's clear immediately to a reader that this is a subjective medium. It's very hard to draw objectively. I mean, if Molly and I are drawing the same thing, you get two completely different things, even if it was the same person from the same angle. So that's subjectivity, and the medium doesn't hide it. And that's what I actually like about it being used in a journalistic sense, because since I don't really believe any journalism is truly objective, this is just saying, this is subjective. You're seeing this story from the eyes of an individual. Journalism is not a science. It's not a science if you're writing prose. When you're drawing, it's clear that it's not a science.
And sometimes drawing enables you to capture things in a truthful way through that sort of subjectivity that writing and photography can't. One thing I always think of with Joe's work is there's a scene when he's going into a home of some Palestinians and they're telling him about experiences they've had under the occupation. And the speech bubbles are overlapping and they're interweaving with each other, and you can't even read any of the text because there's just so much. And if you've ever been to a refugee camp in a context where you're chronicling things in some way or another, one of the first experiences you often have is you get in and people think you have some power over something and they start telling you their stories. And so many people are telling you their stories all at once, and you can't necessarily write everything down. You just sort of, you stand and you listen, and there are all these people around you talking. And you can't capture that with a photo, right? And you can't capture that with writing. I mean, you could say lots of people were talking at once, but you can't capture what that really is. But the way Joe drew that, he captured that. He showed what that actually was. He showed the truth of that. And I liked what Joe said about art being obviously subjective. I call it defiantly subjective sometimes in my lectures. Because journalism sometimes very falsely adopts this sort of God's eye view of the world. And I'm not against objectivity as an ideal, actually. I used to be much harsher on it, but now in the sort of era of the spray tan donkey ruling my country and his obsession with fake news and Alex Jones and all of that, I actually think that some standard of trying for objectivity is good, but it's an ideal. It's not something we ever achieve as humans. It's just what we aim for.
Perfect, thank you. Now, I'm going to have to share with the rest of this audience in a moment, but one last question from me. What works best for me about both of your, about the art you both create is that it helps us like get past the moral and the sort of mental numbness that we sometimes face when we think about war or about exploitation. That's so important to stay alive to some of that. But I imagine that the focus that you both maintain on that, on subjects that are so difficult, must take a toll on you. So, how do you manage? Do you have a strategy for following the subjects that you think are most important, but not giving in to despair or nihilism or depression?
I try to focus on people that I admire in a lot of ways. Like when I was doing my piece about Abu Dhabi, there's a lot of work about migrant workers in the Gulf that sort of posits them as these like victims who are like completely naive and exploited and almost like cow-like in their suffering. It's very insulting, I find. And I didn't want to do something like that. So my main character, I suppose you would say, was a young man named Ibrahim, who was this astoundingly sharp young guy who was from working class background, obviously, but spoke 5 languages, and who was working as a T-boy for a construction company while surreptitiously giving quotes to activist groups and fixing for every single like major human rights organization. And because the Gulf is such a profoundly racist place, was getting away with it in large part because no one could have ever imagined that a blue-collar Pakistani guy could have been utterly outwitting everyone. And he was just this amazing, sharp, funny, sarcastic dude, and that was who I wrote about. Like, that was the center of my story. And I think what keeps me from despair in a lot of ways is knowing so many people like that, so many people of just like strength and resilience and sharpness and humor, especially humor, right? And wit. Not necessarily these like, you know, saints or whatever, no, but like hustlers, like sharp, rebellious people. I suppose that's what keeps me alive, and also drinking, I guess.
Joe, my sense about your work is that your solution to this is injecting the satire and the absurdity of your own presence and of your own kind of curious quest in those situations.
That's part of it, but truth be told, after I finished the book Footnotes on Gaza, I thought I would actually stop doing journalism. I was just a bit fed up. I thought I would look at subjects that basically didn't have an AK-47 in them. So I've tried that. I mean, let's talk about this story I'm doing about the Northwest Territories. I thought, okay, indigenous people and resource extraction, but then of course you learn about residential schools, and then you realize it's almost always about violence somehow, just violence through other means. And I'm not sure it can be escaped. So I've just sort of resolved myself to continue, but not to, I don't think I want to focus too much on physical violence, though when I do focus on it, like the riot story, I want to sort of think of it in terms of ideas, like why people tell themselves the stories they do. The other way I've learned to change it up a bit is just work on other projects that are different, working on some satire. It's also, to me, it's very relevant work, very political too, but I actually enjoy drawing in that Robert Crumb fashion you were mentioning. And I allow myself every Saturday to work on something I really, really want to do that I'm just dying for Saturday to come along. And you know, it takes a long time to get a project done that you're only doing once a week, but in other words, I've learned to sort of leaven things somewhat.
Good, those are tips for all of us who are trying to keep sane these days. But I'm sure there must be some questions in the audience. If there aren't, I will gladly keep going. There's one in the back and one up in front.
I'm the person you met in the elevator. So
I remember.
My question's towards both of you, especially towards Joe, because you mentioned that you studied journalism, and you both talk about, the subjectivity that cannot be escaped when you're reporting something. And do you ever encounter that sort of disdain that traditional journalists have towards this format of journalism that you do, where you sort of tell stories from your point of view about you tell other people's truths from your point of view, because when you're actually drawing, it's what you see that you're showing. It's not through photographs, and that's something that a lot of them, I just graduated journalism school, and I talked about your work at one of my classes, and the criticism from my professors was that this is not journalism, this is art, and this doesn't qualify as something journalistic because, again, objectivity, which personally I don't agree with, but I'd just like your thoughts on that.
He just wishes he could draw.
I agree, I do agree, that's what I said. I got kicked out of class. So.
Thank you. I mean, I think that there's two things at play, right? There are journalistic standards like fact-checking and verification and all of those, incredibly fucking crucial skills, right, for verifying reality. And none of us should throw those out. Those are vital. But then there's objectivity as an aesthetic, which is not actually about finding truth. It's about wearing a suit and talking kind of like a flat tone of voice, like the NPR voice, and writing in sort of dry prose. And that actually, it's just an aesthetic choice, And I think that that is something that could be taken or left. It's the rigor of the journalistic craft that has to be preserved. And the truth is that in this era where budgets are being shrunk like hell and where more and more outlets are going through clickbait and where, the New York Times is telling journalists to fact check and copy edit themselves. I think we all need to spend more emphasis on the craft and rigor of seeking truth and perhaps less emphasis on speaking in flat voices and writing in flat prose.
Anything to add to that, Joe?
Well, with respect to your professor, I think he or she is wrong. And the funny thing is, I've spent a lot of time with other journalists. I used to avoid journalists in the field, but in the end, it just sort of so happens after a couple of months in a place, people know that you're around and you just run into each other. And I've developed a lot of friendships with even mainstream journalists. And I've never felt any disdain from them. So professionally, I think it's something that you're touching on. If it's clear that you're able to check your facts and you can sort of talk the talk, if you can talk in that rarefied air about a subject, you're in. Or as far as I'm concerned, they're in. So that really isn't a problem. It's funny that your professor must not sort of maybe be in the field because he or she would see that it's not a problem. They recognize what you're doing and they understand it, I think.
Yeah, I have to reiterate what Joe says. Some of the most amazing, welcoming people to me have been journalists working in the field, and I would be like nothing without all of their help, to be honest. And I think that if you're, risking yourself and working really, really hard to get stories that people who are in the field and who are also doing the same thing don't necessarily care that you're doing with a pen rather than with photos or with words. I think it's more, critics or people who aren't, running around Iraq or Palestine that get so bent out of shape over that.
Someone in the back, I thought.
Is it on? Oh. I'm just going to stand up because I'm way at the back here. I'm really curious about your process. So I'm not an artist, but I imagine that going into an area of conflict, it must be sensory overload. So how do you decide what to draw and how to sort of navigate that space as an artist?
Well, I think unlike Molly, I very seldom sketch when I'm in the field. I can see why that would be a good way to meet people and everything, but I think my sort of old college training of what journalism is still sort of seeps into my brain, and to me it's all about interviews. And that's where I put my focus. So I take a lot of photographs, also maybe like you, they're really lousy photographs, but they're really good for reference. That's how I approach it. Now, when I'm asking questions, I'm often asking very visual questions, because if it's an experience that they're telling me about, I need to draw it somehow. So I tend to ask questions maybe above and beyond the traditional ones, I would say. So I do my research and come back home, I write a script, and then chain myself to a desk with interruptions for things like this, and just draw.
With me, I do, well, I sketch a lot in the field, and a lot of it is to kind of get my head in the right place and also just to hang with people. And a lot of times when I sketch with people, I just sort of sit with them and I ask them questions and I jot down what they say next to it, and I have a recorder. So it's like I'm doing the interview, but the sketch pad is in between us, almost an icebreaker or just a way for me to be less nervous. And then I also take 1 billion photos, and then I usually do my finished work from those photos that I've taken. With my book with Marwan, it's a little bit different because obviously I wasn't in Raqqa, I wasn't in Mosul, I wasn't in Aleppo, you know, when it was held by rebels. So for those, I was relying on a mixture of photos he had taken, video he had shot sometimes, but also the huge amount of citizen photo and video that's online from the Syrian war. So for instance, if I wanted to do a picture of a demonstration, right? The video might be like really blurry handheld camera footage. It's, you know, vertical. When, you know, the YouTube thing is horizontal, it's like everywhere. And so if to draw the demonstration from that, I might look at a bunch of citizen video of the same demonstration. It's all like this, it's all blurry, it's all mess. And freeze frame it, and freeze frame like 40 or 50 or 60 shots from it. And then I would interview Marwan, and I would ask him specific things and specific like memories he had and what was important. And then maybe to get things right, like how a hand is, I might pose a model after to look, to be in the same position as like the blurry YouTube still is, so that I could make sure like all the joints connected and stuff. And from all of that, I might do like a massive scene with, you know, like 100 people in it. Even though in the YouTube video, no more than 3 people are in the shot at any one time, but it's like panning over people for like 5 minutes. Then there's also stuff that I would do from Marwan's memories where there wasn't any video. And for that, I would interview him, and he would tell me how things were. He'd often would like do a sketch. He would find as much reference as he could online of like what a gas canister looked like, what people wore, whatever. And then I would do sketches and I would show him, and he would say like, no, that's totally wrong. You ruined it. It's a cliche. And I would like refine it until I had got something that was as close to his memories as possible. And it's really intensely collaborative. But for most of my stuff, it's just from photos I took or sketches that I made.
Do we have any more questions? I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. Wherever the mic is, I guess.
Hi. So one of the tough parts of being an artist is how much time you get to dedicate to doing art versus how much you have to dedicate towards keeping yourself fed and housed and like just making a living off of your art. I'm wondering if there was a point in your career so far where that became something you didn't have to worry about, or if it's still a struggle, or how do you get to that point, especially doing non-commercial art such as yourselves, where you can just do your passion instead of having to spend so much time frustrated and worried about living doing it?
I mean, I got really lucky, and also I was like a total hustler, and you know, a lot of people, I feel like they bullshit a lot with this answer. They're like, I was just so talented and special that the world recognized it and gave me a lot of money. No, that was not the case at all. I wasn't even that good at the start. You know, it took a while to get where I was satisfied. I worked obsessively, like I worked like an insane person. At the start of my career, I worked as a go-go dancer and a nude model because I didn't want to work like a low-paying retail job where I'd be tired at the end of the day. instead I worked something where I got paid a relatively large amount of money in a short amount of time, and I drew for the rest of it. I did every possible thing in the world to try to get money for my artwork at first, and then once I was actually getting money for my artwork, and this is like, I'm not talking about like very, very fancy, like my heart and soul work. I'm talking about, I don't know, illustrating people's children's books about squirrels and stuff, self-published children's books about squirrels. Or like storyboarding self-produced videos about cockroaches taking over New York. Very elite I was. Then I put everything into doing the type of art that I wanted to do, and I worked like an insane person. I spent all my time trying to find like opportunities to do the type of work that I wanted to do. I was also lucky. And I also knew that I had no other option for myself because I just was not a socially functional enough human to get a real job, and so it was this or die for me.
I have to add in here to Molly's credit, because she's not going to say this herself, is that what's the difficulty Molly's facing right now is that she's prying time out of all of the time that's available to her to create her art, to do work that's pro bono, and to do work that isn't art at all, but that's community organizing and other things that seem to be necessary at this point and at this political moment. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, because it's very admirable.
Thank you. Well, I mean, my country just elected a fascist, and I think that I have very little patience for Americans who spend their time on Twitter saying that the country has just elected a fascist, but it aren't doing anything about it. You know, when your country elects a fascist, that's a call to action. It means you have to actually resist that, and not resistance in the sense of hashtagging your conspiracy theory posts with resist, but resistance in the sense of actually organizing with other people, even people that you might never have met before, or you might not like, or you know, who might be very, very different than you. So I think it's really, really crucial right now to do that.
I still want to address that question. It's a very good question, because how you make a living is you know, at the end of the day, you have to put bread on the table, and it can take a long time. I was 40 when I could finally not worry about next month's rent. So it can take quite a long time, and you have to wonder if you have to ask yourself if you're ready for that, and also ready for that knowing that there might not be that reward at the end. That's the difficult question I think artists have existentially. Every artist, I think, has to answer that him or herself.
Joe's the sober voice on this.
Sorry about that.
Here's the photographer. Brace yourselves.
Oh. No, I turned off the camera and started drawing like 20 minutes ago. My question actually is a pretty straightforward one, but I'm just curious. Obviously, what's interesting to me is how sort of revolutionary what you guys do is, and also how much of a throwback it is at the same time. It's using all the technologies that have been available for thousands of years, and how a long time record keeping and storytelling was done. And the World War I and World War II stuff you were talking about got me interested in if there's a time in history that you guys long to have been there so you could document it, or a story that you feel like you would have told. So I guess it's kind of a time travel question. Where would you guys go with your sketch pad?
Perhaps the Middle Ages, I guess. I have some favorite artists, and it's usually the Flemish artists in the, I guess, late Middle Ages that I really like, because they, like Bruegel the Elder, just the way he threw a window open on life in that time, it makes me want to be in that time. So that's perhaps a place I'd go.
I have no desire to time travel for places to live. I feel like in most eras of history, I would be dead in childbirth. So I don't really have that longing. But in terms of what I would have liked to have drawn, I don't know. Istanbul right after World War I would have been amazing when all of the white Russian refugees were flooding in, and when like Turkish nationalism was being established and was right about to like kick out the occupying armies, and it was like this time of such artistic ferment and really something that's not much covered or known about here. In terms of other times in history I'm a big nerd about, Al-Andalus, which was the Muslim kingdom in southern Spain. My God, just like the best architecture, best poetry. One of my favorite poets, Walada bint al-Mustakfi, she was an Andalusian princess who had it embroidered on her sleeves in gold. By God, I am meant for high places, and I walk where I want to with a swagger. So I don't know, maybe if I could have drawn there.
Great question. I think we have time for one more, if anyone can beat that.
This is backtracking a little bit, but I'm hoping I can combine a few things. What really strikes me, Joe, in your work that I've seen, and Molly, maybe in yours I want to look into, is drawing yourself into it. And I know we've talked a lot about objectivity, but I'm curious more about how inserting yourself into it makes it almost an autobiographical piece, and that you're recognizing that it's your experience, and at the same time how that, and if it does, allow you to debrief the experience in yourself when you're talking about self-care and how you see all of these things, that inserting yourself and recognizing I was here, this had an impact, because in your work it's not just saying, yes, I'm here, I'm interviewing this person, but your own reflections on the process as you're part of it, and that how that helps you kind of come to terms with the impact that it's had on you through this experience, while also stating, this is not objective, I am here I am on the page as you see me.
That's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure how deeply I've thought about it. I think there are a lot of subconscious elements at work that maybe you're touching on. I don't have an answer for that exactly, how to comment on it, but I'll reflect on it. I actually think that's an interesting point.
I tend not to draw myself ever, really. I think I've drawn very, very few self-portraits. I think I used to work as a model, a low-rent model, and I got really tired of seeing myself, and I just didn't want to. I wanted to look at other people. I wanted to be like the one, like, you know, making my male gaze at everyone. So, but I write about, I do acknowledge that I'm there in my writing, and I tend at this point to only do it when it would be a lie to tell the story otherwise. You know, when I need to contrast something. Like for instance, when I went into this refugee camp in Greece, there was a young Palestinian guy that went up to me and he said, do you really think your stories are going to change anything? Because there's a lot of stories and hasn't changed anything. And I said, no, I don't think they'll change anything, but it's important to keep a record, and maybe it'll make a bastard uncomfortable. And I wanted to write that had happened, you know, so that would be the sort of thing that I would put in. I don't know if it is good for me psychologically or bad, but I just try to write the best story that I can.
Well, making the bastards uncomfortable, I think, is as good a motto as we can take away from this evening. But we've only just skimmed the surface, and there's so much more. There's so much more insight, and there's so much more that's so valuable in all of their books. And I truly encourage you to spend more time with this work. Thanks a lot for sharing this, you guys.
Thank you so much. And thank you. It's an honor to be on the panel with you, and thank you so much, Raghu.
Thank you, too.